Trouble magazine would like to thank its sponsors: Ararat Gallery Tama, Bendigo Living Art Space, Fox Galleries Melbourne, Manningham Gallery, Wangaratta Art Gallery and Western Sydney University. Thanks for your support.
What if a conversation could change your mind about yourself and about the world? What if a conversation could one day lead to a change in government policy? I'm Dr. Mark Halloran, and you're listening to Deep Trouble.
We're here in the studios of Main FM, and I have Mark Halloran with me.
Hi, Steve.
G'day, Mark. And it's the start of the second series of Deep Trouble. We've got some great interviews for your listening pleasure. And the first one we thought we would air is your interview with Benjamin Gilmour, who's a very interesting person, a writer, a filmmaker, and interestingly, a paramedic.
I had read his book, Jirga, Cameras and Kalashnikovs. So Benjamin's been a paramedic in some of the most dangerous areas in the world. I think I was really interested in the theme because the theme is around the relationship between an Australian who goes back to make recompense for a Afghan villager that he's killed during a raid. And so there's all sorts of interesting ideas around the culture of the Taliban and the history of Afghanistan itself, which has been called the graveyard of empires.
A number of the interviews in this series are addressing the relationship between Islam and Western culture.
Yeah, I'm interested in the relationship between Islam and the West. I'm by no measure an expert on Islam, but I think I've engaged people such as Professor Mehmet Alzap, who's an Islamic scholar at Charles Sturt University, and I've been very, very interested particularly in the history and philosophy of Islam. And I think a lot of the conversations around this tend to be polarised, and they also tend to be oversimplified. And so I really wanted to get something that was a little bit more nuanced.
Well, certainly Benjamin Gilmour, he says in this interview that he always tries to find the humanity in his subjects, no matter who they are.
In terms of humanity, if you listen to this series and you listen to the first series of my conversations with the Palestinian refugee, Olfat Mahmoud, what you understand is that human beings and part of humanity is our ability to express infinite amounts of creation and joy, but also rage and cruelty. I mean, you see this in another interview that I do where we discuss the massacre of the Tutsi by the Rwandan farmers. That these were normal people. So normal people are capable of things that are unimaginable because essentially some of that is part of our humanity. And so that's the same thing with the Taliban. The Taliban, whatever else they may be, they're God's madmen.
Can I just stop you there? Because you do use this phrase a number of times, and perhaps it might be a good idea to explain where you got that particular phrase, God's madmen, and how are you using it?
There was a book that was recommended to me by you, actually, which was Yuval Noah Harari's Sapiens. And he makes a distinction between natural law religions and sort of the more spiritual religions that have a god at the head of them, like either it's the Abrahamic or dualist religions, and these natural law religions. And natural law religions may be something like Buddhism, but they also might be something like capitalism or Marxism. And what you see is once people are captured by an ideology, an ism, and their thinking becomes concrete and fixed, and there's a loss of flexibility, they are capable of incredibly constructive things, but they're also equally capable of the most horrific crimes that you could imagine. I'll tell you an anecdote that's really interesting to me. I went to see Rap Epstein interview Peter Grest about the time where he was arrested, and which everyone knows about, and he was put into an Egyptian prison because of his association with Al Jazeera, which the Egyptian government was saying was essentially a terrorist organisation. But he was there to talk about that, but he talked about some of his work early on as a journalist, as a foreign correspondent with Afghanistan. It's safe to say that his audience were probably left, centre-left to far left. So there was a few comments around, the imperialist policies of the United States, which he sort of deftly manoeuvred around and avoided. He tells a story about crossing the lines when the United States first entered Afghanistan. and how they had to have white flags in their jeeps as they crossed so that the Taliban would invite them in. And he talks about that sort of a humorous anecdote about having cups of tea with the Taliban. And everyone in the audience was laughing and thought that was wonderful. They stopped laughing when he said that when we stopped doing that was when they started cutting our heads off. So not long after that, the Taliban perceived Western journalists as a threat and they started executing Western journalists. And the laughter in the room quickly died. Because there's a strong reality to that, isn't there?
Certainly is.
And so if there's anything that this series boils down to, it's that the world is a very, very complex, non-linear system, and you will not find one single causative element that you can blame everything on.
It's a very interesting interview, and I hope the listeners enjoyed as much as I did. So let's have a listen to that interview with you and Benjamin Gilmore.
I've read the book Paramedico and watched Jirga and Son of a Lion, and I was interested in the intersection between being a paramedic and becoming a filmmaker.
Yes, Mark, well, I think it's natural, even though they're kind of two different worlds. There's a lot of overlap there, and I think that overlap is mainly in my intentions that drive me to both those interests. So with emergency medicine, with emergency care, with my paramedic work over 22 years, what motivated me to do that is what pretty much motivates most young paramedics to join up, is a desire to help humans who are sick and injured, suffering various morbidities, and who are in situations that they need help getting out of. And I suppose that with filmmaking, it was a similar calling. I'd never set out to make films for the sake of making films per se, or for the sake of entertainment alone, but rather a cause presented itself to me. And that happened not long after 9/11 in the world's response to the attacks in New York, and particularly around the way that Muslims were being talked about in the media and in the community. And just off the back of a time I had spent travelling and living in Pakistan with the Pashtun people on the border with Afghanistan, when my experiences during that time were just overwhelmingly positive. And so hearing a lot of negativity around Muslims at that time was something that kind of got under my skin a bit, and I suppose I felt that I wanted to go into bat for my friends. I think that's where Son of a Lion really came from, whereas Jirga, which about 10 years later, made in Afghanistan, was more of a film in response to ongoing occupation. And in a sense there, the link between paramedic work and filmmaking was in the fact that if you can do something that might contribute to the ending of war, then I guess the absence of war is also the absence of morbidity and mortality and reduction in mental illness and post-traumatic stress and suicide. So that an anti-war film, a protest film, which I would describe Jirga as, is my way of contributing to criticism of war and just shining a bit of light on the impact of war, even in just a small way, to perhaps influence people's thinking and, perhaps rooted in thinking that it will make a difference. But in a sense, the motive is very similar to that which drives my ambulance work, in the sense of trying to save lives, really.
I think there's about 8,000 people lost every year or the last year in Afghanistan. I'm not even sure if that was just Kabul. It's a country that's been ravaged by war, by a series of invasions. I read in a Times article in New York, someone had said that the Afghan people are only a people at peace when they're at war, which sounded uncharitable, but I think what they meant was that that there was the British invasion in the 1800s. There was the Soviet-Afghan war stretching between 1978 and 1989, and then, of course, an American invasion after 9/11, and the civil wars that occurred in between. But these are people, no invasion has been successful.
No, graveyard of empires, they call it. And, there are a lot more people lost in those most recent wars in Afghanistan than that. We're talking, something in the realm of, 6.5 million people forced out of their homeland, and that's since 1979, when the Russians went in. And, of course, about 2.5 million actually killed by war or famine during the last 20 years. And that includes, maybe a lot longer than that. So we're talking millions of people affected. I mean, you have a country that's been ravaged by war. And so I have heard that, and I've heard it from Afghans as well, about their people being only at peace when they're at war. I mean, yes, I also, as you say, it's uncharitable. I also have an issue with it in the sense that when I was working on Jirga, the overwhelming impression I got was that the people had had enough of war. They didn't want a bar of it anymore. They wanted to live in peace. And they were an extremely war-weary population. And so, I think they'd be happy with peace. It just so happens that most of the population don't even know what that feels like. They don't know what it feels like because, it's a country of a majority young people who have only ever known a state of war in their land. People my age, up to the age of around 40, I mean, we're talking about 1978, 79. I mean, there was already trouble brewing in the late 70s, but they've just grown up in that state.
Before that, places like Kabul were reasonably democratic. It's mentioned in your book even that, and family members of mine went through Afghanistan in the 70s. It was part of the hippie trail.
Very popular destination on the hippie trail, and not only for the inexpensive hashish that was available, but I think there was this general feeling. I mean, I read a lot of hippie diaries or overland traveller diaries from that time, and the descriptions of coming into Afghanistan from Iran and feeling as if, you'd step onto the set of, 1001 Arabian Nights, and how magical and the place was and how romantically they wrote about it. And, it's just so well preserved. I mean, really, there are plenty of parts of Afghanistan where there are people in the villages who have really not living any differently than their ancestors did 1,000 years ago. And they've just kind of watched the hordes pass by from the mountaintops and these strange things flying across the sky and going back to their field. It's really interesting because there's a great opportunity. And there was a great opportunity before the West went in there most recently to learn from a country like that. Here's a pre-industrialization culture that has got so much to teach us and so much we can learn from. And there are very few left like that. And in many places, they're living very effectively with their ancient traditions and practices with a very minimal footprint, if anything. I mean, from an environmental perspective, this kind of simple life that people in the West are now trying to recreate and trying to come back to as they recognise pitfalls of modernisation. We had these opportunities to learn from the Afghans, and instead we've gone in trying to civilise them, modernise them, and bring them out of the dark ages or whatever dubious motives were, or justifications for the invasion occupation were. But once you start travelling in some of these places and through the villages in the east and the south, I mean, man, it's just incredible. The amount of the social richness of these tribes is something to be envied, and a lot of people who've worked in Afghanistan have fallen in love with what it has to offer and what it has to teach us,
I think that's what came through with reading the book, Cameras and Kalashnikovs, was your emotional connection, particularly to the Pashtun people.
Originally, with the Pashtuns, when I first really learned about Afghanistan, it was via the Pashtuns that I was living with, making son of a lion across the border in Pakistan and tribal areas. And so I was very kind of Pashtun-centric, and I really admired their sense of humour and their resilience and their wild looks, their beards and their turbans and their Kalashnikovs, and how, you'd be sitting in a circle of Pashtun men and they'd be reciting poetry and holding roses, but, Kalashnikovs on the other hand, and they were kind of fierce warriors, but beautiful singers and poets at the same time. There's a real kind of romantic ideal that I felt about the Pashtuns and kind of fell in love with that ethnicity. But then in my most recent journeys to Afghanistan and scouting trip, I guess I took before shooting Jirga, and then in the months spent there making Jirga, we had Afghans of every ethnicity on our team. And I learnt a lot from them. And one thing I learnt was that they don't really like talking about ethnicity much anymore, the young people, because they see that it's divisive, So I kind of changed my language a little bit and used the word Afghan rather than Pashtun, because I felt that was reflecting what the youth of Afghanistan the way they were talking about themselves.
I mean, some of the war, I mean, in terms of the Taliban, they essentially lost some of their tribal lineage, so the things that connect them to who they are, you know, in terms of agriculture, in terms of culture. I mean, I know that their interpretation, from what I've read, and I haven't read very much, but their interpretation of the Quran is a mixture of Pashtun tribal values and Islamic faith, and Jirga is part of that.
Yeah, and there was always this argument going on. I remember right back to the Son of a Lion shoot in 2005. And even my first visit to Pakistan along the borderlands in 2001, before 9/11, before so much changed there politically, was this argument between your ethnicity and your religion. And because, you know, the Pashtun identity is so strong among the Pashtuns, but it predates Islam by around 1,000 years.
Right.
I think Herodotus or you know, someone like some Greek
philosopher
writer made first reference to the Pashtuns in 200 BC or something, and that you know, the kind of intellectual would argue that no, we are Pashtun first, you know, and so I was always caught up in this argument. They go on forever, you know, what you're most loyal to, and I think, you know, there were consequences if you were voting for being a Pashtun first rather than a Muslim first, you know, because there's this kind of like pious element going on in the villages, you know, where if you kind of identified as Pashtun before you identified as Muslim, that you were somehow un-Islamic. But yeah, I mean, look, I think within the Taliban there is very strong Pashtun identity, but of course, you know, there's this thing that's kind of hung over from the 80s when Saudi Arabia, you know, kind of exported its Salafi philosophy and its extremism to mobilize forces against the Soviets, that you know, religion was being used as a means of motivating, you know, kind of politically and cynically being used as a way of motivating these simple foot soldiers who were generally uneducated youth from the villages whose families could only afford to send them to religious madrasas, these seminaries on the border, and then they were kind of brainwashed into Soviets, you know.
Yes.
And so, you know, there's still that extremist element that they can't shake.
You're listening to Deep Trouble. Dr. Mark Halloran in conversation with Benjamin Gilmore, filmmaker and paramedic.
I guess, to some extent, the heart of your film, essentially the premise of the film is Mike Wheeler, played by Sam Smith, goes to Afghanistan because he's accidentally killed a civilian and he feels tremendous guilt about it. And so he travels to Kandahar, which is Taliban country, back to a fictional village where this occurred, this killing during an Australian raid. He's captured by the Taliban. And so I remember reading in your book, you looking for a reason why the Taliban would support him in his mission. And what it came back to was Pashtun honour culture.
Yeah, Pakhtunwali. So for a bit of context for people who don't know, Pashtuns subscribe to their ancient code of conduct known as Pakhtunwali. And within Pakhtunwali, various tenets, one of them being, you know, Badal, which is revenge. And that's kind of what they're most famous for. Their blood feuds and sayings like, you know, a man took revenge after 100 years and even then he took it too early. You know, they're historically quite proud of this. But what people don't sometimes, even in that culture, often forget is that Nanawati, another tenet of the Pakhtunwali, dictates that if your enemy or if someone who has done you or your tribe harm comes to your door and apologises with sincerity, that you're obliged to forgive them, and not only that, to offer them shelter as a fugitive. So, for example, the rest of the village might be after them to take revenge on your behalf. And if they come to your door, just say they've killed your son, and they come to your door asking for forgiveness or apologising, that you're obliged to do that, and then you're obliged to take them in and protect their lives from the horde outside. And I find that very interesting, and it's a very early example, as many Indigenous cultures have, of restorative justice. This Jirga system, and this is what the film's title is based on, is a circle of elders that discuss your fate, and then, you know, if you have remorse, they can choose to in fact, they're obliged to let you off or to allow you to offer some compensation, and usually to give the family who has suffered the crime the right to make a decision. So, yeah, I mean, I'm fascinated by the Pakistan Wall, and I learned a lot about that from sitting with elders back during Son of a Lion and just having those months and months while we were trying to make this film. Of course, you can't shoot every day, and the pace is much slower in that part of the world, so it defies any kind of traditional film shoot where you've got a strict schedule and you've got people employed, you know, by the day to shoot. And you just, to make a film in that part of the world, you have to have enormous patience. You have to set aside months of your time. You have to be comfortable with that frustration of not moving forward, of just sitting and drinking tea and discussing and, you know, various political topics and cultural topics. And slowly, you know, people who are hosting you are also working collaboratively with you, but in their own pace, you know. But what that allows is you to really kind of immerse yourself in that culture, and there's a great benefit in that, you know. It's not, I mean, it's talk at the moment about, you know, white people making films about non-white people, about, you know, people who come into a culture and want to depict them in a certain way.
Yes.
And I can understand those issues because in the past, Hollywood has certainly dressed up Mexicans to look like Afghans and made their war films in the Nevada desert, and it's all very fake and inauthentic. But I think it's very different to the experience I've had, which has been months and months of living with the tribes and eventually becoming a vehicle for them to tell their story, basically submitting yourself. I found I was surrendering myself to their choices and, you know, allowing myself to be a tool for them to share their grievances or their stories with the wider world.
I feel like your connection to Pashtun was that they've got an incredible tradition of poetry and music. So, and it was interesting to me that you had a friend who left the Taliban because they didn't really support music. But they do like poetry. They don't like lots of things in relation to the modern world in terms of television or the internet or dancing.
Well, that's changing. And there has been a cultural shift among the Taliban. It's really hard to say anything generally about the Taliban because there are so many different groups.
Heterogeneous group.
You know, I told there are around about 5 major Taliban groups. I'm talking about little commanders in their groups. I'm talking about, you know, who they're aligned with. You know, some run by, you know, the Pakistanis, others loyal and funded by to the Russians, and funded, you know, ironically, Iran, India, and so on. You know, you hear these kind of rumours going around. You've got the original kind of Afghan Taliban, and you've got the Pakistani Taliban. Of course, it's funded by the Pakistani Secret Service, and so, you know, which are kind of like also described as a regiment of the Pakistani army.
The ISI.
Yeah, by the ISI, it's how they kind of get influence and always have had influence in Afghanistan. I think I was just reading the other day that the Pakistani ambassador to Iran, you know, once declared that the Taliban were indeed a regiment of their army. This was during Taliban rule in the 90s. And to an extent, that hasn't really changed. But in terms of what they like, what they don't like, I mean, what was interesting not long ago when there was a brief pause in the fighting and there was a kind of ceasefire on a weekend not long ago, over Eid last year, that the Taliban, you know, fighters came into the cities and they had ice cream and they, you know, that women were taking selfies with them, and it was really quite interesting.
I saw a selfie between an Afghan soldier from the government and Taliban. It's interesting when you have those ceasefires, isn't it, that people will just come together and find each other's humanness.
That's exactly right. And I think get freaked out by both sides a bit because, you know, people who are invested in the war, and there are Afghans who are invested in the war, who are on the American payroll, who are, you know, who are benefiting from the war in one way or another, and it's not in their interest that this war ends, that people see the humanity of each other and stop fighting. You know, and the last thing they want to do is that to happen. But that's exactly what happened. But in terms of cultural shift, I mean, in Jalalabad where we were shooting, which is a Taliban hotbed really, and all around the mountains there, you've got villages that are occupied by Taliban, including the village where Cheryl Miskino studied, plays a taxi driver in our film, grew up. And in a lot of those places, they have Twitter, they have Facebook, they have, where they've got connection, of course, but they've got phones.
Yes.
They turn a blind eye to people watching TV. They watch TV themselves. They're apparently cricket fans. They're cricket mad.
Right.
I heard on the grapevine that, they left us alone because we were Aussies and they respected, I don't know whether they respect the Aussie cricket team now, but they respected us for being great cricketers.
I feel like that was the tension within your book and within the film to some extent. This was interesting for me, was that the country has been war-ravaged. It's been called a country of widows since the late 70s, and there's obviously disdain for Russian and American invasion, but you're also seeing people suffering. From 1996 to 2001, Taliban rule, and in 2010 to 2012, between 76 and 80% of civilians were killed by the Taliban, according to the UN. But it felt like, so you kind of said, well, I wish that there was an end to these foreign invasions, and I wish that there was an end to extremism. But it felt like there was an internal fight to bring some humanity to the Taliban who appeared in your film, the hospitality and the poetry of that culture, which was interesting to me.
Yeah, and it's true, I would say, absolutely, and we are ready for criticism of that, and we've already had a little bit, not from many people, but
of the positive aspect of, sort of making the Taliban seem...
Well, humanising them.
Humanise them, yeah.
And, I personally, my personal opinion is that just about everyone can be humanised, and I don't say that from under a rock. I mean, I've lived a little and seen a lot of murderers, all sorts of unsavoury people and really troubled people and people who've got a lot of, who are very, very broken and injured from their experiences of life and their upbringings and so on. So I've always tried to find humanity in even the most unlikely individuals, and very rarely do I fail to find that bit of light somewhere within them. And so I think that Taliban's no different, and they're a really mixed bunch. And all you really need to do is actually jump onto YouTube. But there are a couple of journalists who have in the past been embedded with the Taliban and have made documentary films. And so you can kind of get to see the sense of humour and, the ordinariness of a lot of these guys who have got nothing, they've got so little, and they're walking from their villages to that gun they've got in the mountains, and they're waiting for that American convoy to come past so they can fire off a few rounds and then go back to their families in the, on the dirt floor of their little mud brick house and carry on. And with that kind of really simple intent, which is, we don't want foreign occupation. And I think the way we're told about these wars makes it sound so complicated, and I think that's an illusion. I think it's a bit of hoodwinking. I think our politicians are very good at, oh no, it's a lot more complicated than that, and you've got, the opium element, and you've got criminality, and you've got Russia, and you've got Iran and Pakistan. Like, yeah, I get all those things, but to the majority of your Taliban foot soldiers in, Kandahar and Helmand, they're in walking distance from their villages, and they believe they're in the 1980s fighting off the Russians.
Right.
They believe it's just another
they're
version
an extension
of that.
Of the Mujahideen.
The Mujahideen. They don't call themselves the Taliban. They call themselves Mujahideen, and it's all the Muj,
Right.
And so they're really just reliving the Russian, and they're having a similar outcome. Americans are pulling out, much the way the Russians did.
I guess it's difficult because it feels as though there's a philosophical and religious divide that you would have to broach. I mean, in terms of the complexity of it, and I don't want to sound like an apologist, but the original Taliban would have been children of war. So they went through the Russian war and fought in the Russian war. The Taliban, I think, means student. And so they said that the Americans were indoctrinating them with the most extreme version of Islam because they wanted them to fight against the Russians. And now we have the situation where Americans are accusing the Russians of aiding the Taliban, which is we don't have the end of history. We just have a repeat of what's occurred.
It's interesting, that the Taliban kind of arose from the ashes of that occupation and the millions of weapons left behind, weapons paid for by the Americans largely. And a few other countries. And then you had these competing warlords who, kept competing for power there. And there was this chaos in which civilians were dying in enormous numbers and losing their legs and landmines and whatnot. And from that chaos, from that criminality, where you couldn't go more than 5 or 10 kilometres without a checkpoint, some warlord was collecting money, and so poor people just couldn't get around. They were stuck and getting bombed. That the Taliban decided to bring law and order to the country, and albeit it was a very strict type of law and order, and I think Mullah Omar was actually spurred on to bring his religious students together to form a ragtag army after the rape of several girls in his town. And they'd had enough of this kind of criminality. So, and then went out in great numbers and brought law and order to the country to the point where it is said that ordinary people could leave a bag of gold on the streets and it'd still be there the next day. I don't want to justify their interpretation of law and order, but, it came at a time when you could see why, and it was embraced by Afghans in the early stages.
Dr. Mark Halloran in conversation with Benjamin Gilmour, filmmaker and paramedic.
This is my impression. I've never been to Afghanistan, but in terms of reading about it, and I'm certainly no expert, but it always feels like the Afghanistani people are stuck between these extreme forces, like extremist forces. That it seemed to me that the Northern Alliance was reasonably democratic, and I don't think that they were accused of any war crimes, and they opened schools for girls and things like that. Of course, the leader of the Northern Alliance was assassinated, but it seems like an extreme group has to arise to take order, but then they become the oppressor. So the Taliban then, they rejected UN aid to 160,000 starving people. They were kidnapping people, committing genocides in Somalia, and some of the Taliban were sending women into Pakistan into sex slavery. And so it seems like there's I think, a heterogeneous group, but it feels like it quickly descends into chaos. Once you have that strict observance, Muhammad Omar, they actually started to move away from my understanding, the Pushtun values and away from Jirga, and he kind of announced himself as not a caliph, but as a supreme leader. And then they dispelled of the need for a Jirga and a council. It seems like a very complex system and place and political system, and dangerous.
The impression I got from the Afghans that we worked with and that I met on all my trips is that they do exactly feel as if they're caught in the middle of all these forces that are trying to want a piece of the pie, and have got their proxy armies, and there are a lot of Taliban groups who are proxy armies, and the Taliban, you've got the Afghan Taliban who are native to the country, who are doing it for those reasons I described earlier. But there are also ones on the payroll of the Pakistanis and other countries, and then you've got ISIS in the northeast and so on. But the locals are just sick and tired of just people just meddling in their country and then being caught in between, and they just want to be left alone. And it's one of those things where I think that because, say, America wanted to stay for a long time because they were worried that the Russians would stay, and Russians would be there in one way or another, or the Iranians having influence because they don't want the Americans to get hold of it, get control of the place, and the Pakistanis want to bleed America out, and see it fail because they've always had that kind of thing going with the Americans, and so there's all these players. It was the British and the Russians earlier, wasn't it? The great game during the 1800s.
I do want to talk about you though as well. And your experience. I watched the film and read the book, Cameras and Kalashnikovs, and it was you and Sam Smith in Kabul because the film had been shut down in Pakistan. Kabul, an incredibly dangerous city. I guess my point was that you've been a paramedic for 20 years.
Yeah.
And it seemed like Sam Smith was justifiably terrified.
Yeah.
When you were in Kabul, he read on the internet about the hotel that he was in had been raided by Taliban, people had been executed. But you didn't seem to be. And I wondered whether you've kind of attenuated to danger.
Yeah. I think there are a few reasons, and I've reflected on this, the difference in Sam's response to the environment and the situations and my response. And, and it's much the same way as, say, if a person who never experienced a nasty car accident sees one happening in front of them or comes around a corner and there's one on the road in front of them, their reaction may be very different to someone like myself who's seen dozens, hundreds of car accidents. To me, unless it's, something really outrageously horrific, I don't think my heart rate will go up at all, because this is what I'm fairly accustomed to managing, because it's my job.
Right.
So, as a paramedic, one element of your job is that, you are constantly expecting surprise, because you never know what you're going to go to. You never know who's going to open the door, whether there is someone ice-affected wielding a knife, or whether, so you develop these ways of protecting yourself, just kind of streetwise stuff about keeping your distance, checking your exits, so situational awareness.
Yes.
And then you're always expecting the unexpected. It's a kind of state I live in, and I've had the privilege and the benefit of that because of my career, whereas Sam didn't have that. So, in fact, he hadn't really been to Asia before in his life, He hadn't even been to India or anywhere like that.
Because you can just be overcome by the sheer numbers of people as well in a city like that.
The people and the traffic and the heat and the dust and the dirt and,
Yeah.
Quite aside from the fact you're hearing mortar rounds on the mountain, you've got the risk of someone potentially coming to your door and working out what you're going to do. So he was, a lot more heightened state. But I think there's something beyond that element too, and it probably stems back to my spirituality, my perception of, how the universe is, my connectedness to, a greater force, or, sometimes I feel as though, and it's a feeling, it's not necessarily based on any particular philosophy or anything, but sometimes I feel that there are problems with this point of view, I'll say in the outset, but sometimes I feel as though if what I'm doing is good and right and noble and, good for the world and for other human beings, that someone's got my back, or, that I have a certain level of protection. Now, of course, that argument fails because plenty of other people who've gone before me have had a similar motive and intention and have not fared so well. So that kind of puts a hole in that argument. I can understand from a rational point of view that it doesn't really hold, but it is a feeling, nevertheless, that I had while I was there. I can't explain the feeling, but I had a feeling that we were going to be okay. And maybe that's just this kind of same thing as bravado or whatever it is. Maybe it's just this feeling I had to have in order to get through it, like a survival mechanism type thing. And I share that with the Afghans, with a lot of Muslims I've met,
Yes, I thought that. Like that was, you said in one point in the book that you felt a sense of protection, that the forces that created the mountains around Kandahar would be the same forces that protected you, and I had that sense that might be what connected you to people who are tribal and people who have a very intense and very old religion. It's an Abrahamic religion. It's very old.
Look, I grew up in a Christian household, and there's been stuff written about, I have said in previous interviews, and my father's an Anglican minister, and, of course I went on my own spiritual journey when I was a teenager and lived in a Buddhist monastery in India and spent time with Muslims and read the Mahabharata and so on. So I'm interested in religions in general. I wouldn't say I've prescribed to a religion per se, but what I admire about Muslims and what I admire about and obviously, a lot of Christians have the same thing going on, is this kind of this level of faith that your life is written, that there's not too much you can do. You can obviously have common sense, but ultimately, the majority of people die in their own homes. So even with common sense, you're not insulated from death. It's around the corner. It can come knocking any time, anywhere. So that leaves you with this kind of, certainly this kind of level of fatalism, or let's just say, faith in the fact you're living your destiny, and that when your time's up, your time's up. And even though you take all precautions, there's nothing you can do to prevent it. So all you can do is go through, try and be streetwise, take as many precautions as you can, be smart about what you're doing, but the rest is up to some kind of spiritual domain that's beyond your control. Afghan would say, inshallah, God willing. You always say, we talked about going all the way to Jalalabad Road, Kabul, one of the most dangerous roads in the world. You've got Taliban firing at you sometimes. You've got these huge drops, along the cliff. It's really, a lot of cars go over into the Kabul River. Are we going to be okay going down that road? Inshallah. What is the reply every time? God willing, we'll be okay. And that's the Afghan attitude. It's like, well, I hope so. There's no guarantees. We could die. But if God wills us, we'll survive it,
It seems like because you've confronted death a lot.
Yeah, never know. I never know, maybe. Well, when you see the majority of deaths that I see, the paramedic, are people in bed, people next to the toilet, people on the kitchen floor, right? People who are too scared to leave the house. They're the majority of deaths I see. So that helps me to go, well, hang on a second. You can take all the protective measures you like, but if you live in a state of fear and you're locking your door and you're stopping the fresh air from coming in, you are going to deteriorate as a human being. You're not going to enjoy your life. You're not going to have all those lovely dopamine feelings and, fitness and good health and all those things. That's what kills the majority of people, not getting sniped in the Afghan mountains. I mean, up there, those are always going to be risks with that journey, and you take calculated risks. And I don't think we did anything majorly stupid. We took precautions in Jalalabad. We had the police on notice. They were there. The Afghan National Army was escorting us in the mountains when we shot. We had the US military, the Air Force notified so they didn't hit us with a Hellfire missile from any drone. That was a risk.
That's when you said that you felt actual fear. I remember the riding with the Afghan police to Tora Bora and also being confronted by an American drone.
Yeah, that was my greatest concern, and the there were moments that gave me a tickle, but this was the one time I actually felt a good bit of adrenaline, was when we were shooting a scene on a road outside Jalalabad in the mountains, and the car dropped Amir Shah and myself off. He was our Afghan producer, and we were on the side of the road together, and we were dressed. I was dressed like an Afghan, and I had my beard, and I had a Paco hat on, and I had my camera, and we were shooting a scene where a bus comes past and disappears around the bend. So the bus came past, disappeared around the bend, and we were waiting to get picked up. And then a drone appeared over a ridge and flew right over the top of us and hovered about 5 metres above us. Now, it wasn't an armed drone, but this is exactly what I was concerned about, that we would be mistaken for militants in the mountains and shot at. Essentially, under Obama, and I think the policy's changed now, but under Obama, there's this very controversial rule that came up at one point in relation to drone strikes, was that any group of males of fighting age on a mountaintop in Afghanistan is fair game. So a lot of civilians have been taken out that way. It hasn't helped the popularity of the Americans.
You're listening to Deep Trouble. Dr. Mark Halloran in conversation with Benjamin Gilmour, filmmaker and paramedic.
It is interesting. Noam Chomsky in his book Who Rules the World points out that the drone strike assassinations and even the assassination of Osama bin Laden was in violation of the Geneva Conventions to a fair trial. I mean, even Eichmann got a trial.
Well, isn't it funny? And I was just reading something today. I never quite figure out, like in a civilian environment, we believe in a fair trial. We believe in due process. In America, it's the Fifth Amendment that, that's what you expect in a civilian environment. But we've got a completely other set of rules for people in other countries, But they're just like us. I mean, they've got families, they've got kids they love, they've got grandmas, they go to school, they go shopping and cook and try and feed their families. And then yet, if they look slightly suspicious or there's some information that's been passed to the Americans, commonly by people one tribe has enmity with, who would like nothing more than for their enemy tribe to cop a missile, they'll just tell the Americans that they're Taliban, and that intelligence, which is almost always bad, I might add, ends up leading to a whole bunch of deaths at the end of a missile. I mean, that's deplorable, and it's just no wonder America has failed in that part of the world. If you're just hunting people down, instead of giving them what they really need to insulate their country against being used as a base for terrorism, what they really need is food and literacy, books, education, and you're just in the mountains hunting them with missiles that cost $2 million a pop, enough money to put 100,000 Afghan kids through school.
I mean, there are lots of positive things about the Obama administration, but when I put this question to Dan Pfeiffer, who was his communications director, in a written interview, he didn't respond to it, essentially.
Really?
Because it's a very difficult issue. I mean, we sometimes see people in other places in parts of the world, Chomsky says this is non-people, and so it sort of becomes...
It's the tyranny of distance.
It becomes unreal, essentially. It's in your movie. I mean, the Taliban commander who was played by, what was his name?
the guy who played the commander, Bashir.
He takes the character Mike Wheeler to a place where his family, his brother or brother-in-law has been, their wedding party had been hit by a drone missile strike. And so it's almost inconceivable to people who are not living in those circumstances what it would be like to lose your entire family in those circumstances. I talked to Dr. Olfat Mahmoud, who was a Palestinian refugee living in a Palestinian refugee camp in Lebanon, and she talked about those conditions, you know, the attacks from Lebanese Christian militia that you know, this is being part of what drives people towards extremism. It's not an excuse, but you'd have to understand that would be horrific. It's unimaginable to live in those circumstances.
Oh, absolutely. Violence breeds violence, you know. Violence breeds violence. I long believe that. And this whole tyranny of distance thing is a big thing. And this is the beauty of what film can do, is to kind of force people into a position of empathy. Like, all you need to do is get yourself onto the cinema seat, and then the filmmaker will take you on that journey of empathy and journey into the lives of people you ordinarily, you just see as statistics, or, you know, you see in a passing news flash, and suddenly it becomes a lot difficult to accept us killing those people or accept civilian casualties.
It feels as though the film is about guilt, essentially. Do you relate to that?
Oh, in terms of Afghanistan, yeah, absolutely. You know, I think someone took a shot at the film and said, you know, it's about white man's guilt. But I wouldn't deny that. I wouldn't deny that. Of course it is. Of course, I feel guilty about what's been done in my name. You know, I didn't vote to be there for 17 years, and you know, with a military strategy that was going to fail. You know, I mean, I didn't vote to go into Iraq. You know, it's deplorable the way the West and Australia and following Americans into these blunders has conducted itself in these parts of the world. The disrespect, the killing. You know, I'm disgusted by it. I feel guilty of it. And so there is that guilt. And I think it's a healthy guilt that has led to making a film that people are responding to. And I wish more people would feel that guilt and sit with that guilt and reflect on it. You know, I'm ashamed of how it has oftentimes conducted itself. And, you know, I mean, good motives. Australian troops have really tried very hard and tried to make a difference. And I certainly don't blame the troops. Obviously, you know, I believe in all soldiers should follow international humanitarian law and the rules of war. I mean, I have rules as a paramedic. I can't go around endangering people. But to me, I lay the blame on the decision makers who cannot conceive of a more intelligent strategy than to send more troops and keep hunting the bad guys. It's boring. It's old-fashioned. It doesn't work. Violence breeds violence.
One of the most powerful scenes in the film is the Jirga. So Mike Wheeler confronts the widow of the man that he killed accidentally and his son, and sits before the elders.
Yeah. Well, it's authentic. This is the way these things happen there. And although that part of the script had been written in the first draft that survived it's crucial to the story, you know, it's the title of the film. So it was always going to be there. And it was based on many discussions I had with Hayat Khan Shinwari, who was one of the producers in Pakistan of Son of the Lion, about Pashtunwali and their tribal courts and their tribal systems. And, you know, I mean, look, I know Jirgas have not always made wise decisions, and there have been horrific judgments made by Jirgas in some backwaters in Afghanistan, some really remote places, and in Pakistan. And I would never justify those. But what you have, and still have, and had and have in Afghanistan, is an ancient justice system that by and large works very well. And you could build on that by incorporating certain expectations of human rights. You could build on that. But I think what Americans tried to do, what the international community tried to do in Afghanistan with Western-style democracy, it was a kind of failed project in many places, in very rural parts of the South and so on, where you're trying to put in corrupt local officials and judges and these courts that were very susceptible to being bribed and people getting paid off. And basically where you have that level of corruption and word gets around, people will just revert back to their system they know that works, and they know involves a group of elders who all have equal voting power and is essentially, and there's a lot of elements of democracy in that. You've got elders that have, and you even have female Jirgas, which not a lot of people are aware of. So I find that Jirga system quite interesting, and he submits himself willingly to that, which also was important to show that he was a man, a Westerner, with real humility, who was going to accept whatever judgment they laid down.
I think it was a stunning scene. I mean, you talked about them being the elders that comprise the Jirga as being non-professional actors, but I was stunned by their performance. And you talked about it being undirected. I think the elder crying out at the end about Allah and his mercy, and the performance by the boy who played the son as well. And simply his look, the look of a young boy in a rural community who is already an old man.
Yeah, it lives such a hard life, and even that chief of that village still gets up at 3 a.m. and goes into the fields and harvests his fields and works in the fields, and the boys as well are out very early and until late at night, just trying to survive, just trying to make a living, and there's a drought in the country. So not only are Afghans facing war and insecurity, but, drought and food insecurity. But yeah, in that village, that was just a gift, because we didn't really have to do much work with those elders. They were just terrific, and they conducted I know it's a drama film, but we briefed them through Amir Shah, and then they conducted a real Jirga as if a former soldier had come back and wanted to apologise for a war crime. And they put Mike, the character of Mike, played by Sam Smith, through that process, and we caught that on film. So there was no real lines learnt in the traditional sense. And as far as the boy goes, we picked him from a crowd of youngsters about 10 minutes before we shot. And a lot of people have remarked about his face and his performance. And, you could have had a traditional audition where you invited actor kids to come, but they'd all be kind of from the middle class, educated kids and overfed and whatnot. He was a kid from the village, he was the real deal. And that's the beauty of working with non-actors. You're going to get the real deal, and it's going to feel authentic. And that's what we're going for. I mean, I just find it amazing how a lot of filmmakers making drama where they strive for authenticity. I'm not having to go at actors. I think great actors are really important. But there is this whole layer of real-world people and real-world locations that are just a gift. They're just, it gives me a thrill to work with those authentic elements.
You're listening to Deep Trouble. Dr. Mark Halloran in conversation with Benjamin Gilmore, filmmaker and paramedic.
I really was interested in your relationship with Sher Alam.
He's a very special man, and I think his performance in the film really makes it. And I'm very fond of him, and so is Sam, who considers him like a brother or like a father, and he's a great friend. And when you watch the film, you see Sher Alam, you see the light in his character and him as a person, and I think it's really important for people to see, because they see an Afghan, a simple Afghan taxi driver, and they fall in love with the guy. And I think that's really important, that we start to care, we start to see these people as people, and we start to feel for them and develop an affection for them too. And I think that's the objective. That's what we really set out to do, to highlight how precious these human beings are.
One thing that I would say was about acculturation. I felt like you've been in intense situations, incredibly dangerous situations, both filming as a paramedic, and then I thought the strangeness of coming back to your wife and kids and going to the supermarket.
Yeah, it's bizarre, isn't it?
Yeah.
I just had to remind myself, and I think it was harder for Sam actually to kind of reconnect with his environment here.
Yes.
But you really just got to remind yourself those people haven't had your experience, haven't had your experiences. I had a lot of problem with indulgences, even ice cream.
Yes.
I was like, are we going to buy this $10 tub of boutique ice cream? And you're just conscious. Someone in your family's like, oh, let's treat ourselves, and you have this thought in your mind, and it's hard to get out of it. As my wife always says to me, for a lot of Afghans, if they had an opportunity to taste that ice cream, they would do it. So do it to them.
Yes. Thank you.
No worries, Mark. Well, I look forward to hearing it up.
There was the interview with Benjamin Gilmour, and look forward to the next project that he comes up with. I was interested in the final things he was saying there about the challenges that somebody like that faces merging back into normal society after seeing the things that he's seen.
I talked about that in an interview with Tim Costello as well. So there's a process called acculturation. It's what we used to call culture shock. So you can't go to a place where the culture is almost alien to yours and you see things that are horrific. You see people starving or people who are victims of war-torn failed states, and then come back into a Western democracy and reintegrate into your life without a certain level of distress. I felt that certain level of distress when I left Papua New Guinea and came back here, and that was only a brief stay, but seeing people starving, seeing some of the violence and the health care issues and things like that for women and children, that's distressing. And then you come back to a place of abundance, and it's very difficult to readjust to that, to the injustice of the world, the lottery of latitude, as Reverend Tim Costello calls it.
Well, apparently Jirga is having a cinema release just about now, and I look forward to seeing the film. Okay, next week we've got Dean Cocking on.
Yeah, so Dr. Dean Cocking is a moral philosopher, and he's written a book called Evil Online, and this book is essentially about how evil social media is.
And he's a local, isn't he?
He lives in Castlemaine.
Exactly right. We'll say goodbye. We'll see you next week for another episode of Deep Trouble. Thank you, Mark Halloran.
Thanks very much, Steve.
Deep Trouble is produced by Steve Charman in the studios of Main FM, Castlemaine.
Trouble magazine would like to thank its sponsors: Ararat Gallery Tama, Bendigo Living Art Space, Fox Galleries Melbourne, Manningham Gallery, Wangaratta Art Gallery and Western Sydney University. Thanks for your support.